Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Palestine in Israeli School Books by Nurit Peled Elhanan. I've actually done a longer, more comprehensive review on my Stephen Heiner channel. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. Today I'm going to do a shorter, more focused review focused around three ideas. The first is that Israel has to rewrite the past in order to control the present and the future. The second is that Palestinians have to be presented as subhumans and a problem to be solved. And finally, that maps and vocabulary in Israeli school books underline this narrative of subhumanity and problem solving. And then I'll present one small conclusion towards the end of that. But let's get started. Presenting the Palestinian areas as controlled by the Palestinian Authority, instead of as their native land, and the people who live there as foreign workers, emphasizes the idea that the Palestinians do not belong where they have lived for centuries. The only book that uses the label Palestinians consistently is World of Changes, which was interdicted. This book was pulled from the shelves by the Israeli government. This book labels the conflict the Zionist-Palestinian conflict and the 1948 war a civil war instead of the War of Independence. It is the only book that calls the pre-Israel territory Palestina, as it was actually called, instead of Mandatory Israel, as it is called in other school books. You have to think about what a big stretch that is. It was never called Mandatory Israel anywhere in history except here in Israeli school books. It presents the two adversary sides symmetrically and gives almost equal weight to their arguments and their national claims. Furthermore, World of Changes is the only book in this study where the Palestinian-occupied territories are named the West Bank and not Judea and Samaria or the Western Land of Israel, as in 50 Years in other books. Destroyed Palestinian villages are mentioned by their original names, and even 1948 Eilat is called by its Arabic name Rashrash, as it was called at the time. Since the position of the present study is that no sign is neutral, and every sign is motivated by interests and ideology, the mixture of labels is perceived as motivated not only by disrespect for the name the Palestinian people have chosen for themselves, but also by the perception that it doesn't matter what they call themselves. For us, they are merely Arabs. This perception nourishes the arguments used in Israeli popular and political discourse for barring the return of the Palestinian refugees, along with the argument that Arabs should not be allowed to return to Israel, after many Jews were expelled from Arab countries such as Morocco, Iraq, and Syria. One should bear in mind that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 and in 1967 have not yet become history in the Israeli discourse or practice, and the refusal to take responsibility for the Palestinian refugees bears on the contemporary policies of Israel versus the Palestinian population within the borders of the state and in the occupied territories. The ever-present plans for real and retroactive transfer, the expulsion of the Druze villagers from the Golan Heights, the actual ongoing eviction of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem, of Bedouins from the West Bank and the Negev, are all part of the same continuous process of Judaization. And here you can see a map, but the map is of Greater Israel plus the Golan. So you notice there's no markings for Gaza or the West Bank. And I suspect you, like myself, may not read Hebrew. So there's a translation for that on the very next page. And they're all verses from Scripture. Exodus 23:31. And I will set thy bounds from the sea of Suf, which is the Red Sea, even to the sea of the Pelishtim, the southern shores of the Mediterranean, and from the desert to the river. Deuteronomy 11:24. Every place whereon the sole of your foot shall tread shall be yours, from the river Prath, Syria and Iraq, to the uttermost sea shall be your border. Joshua 1:4. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great sea, towards the going down of the sun shall be your border. Only the verse regarding the spreading is interpreted within brackets into modern Hebrew. The interpretation of the verse, In future, your country will expand to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. Nurit concludes, the answer to the hypothetical question, why doesn't the map show the internationally recognized borders of Israel, is because the Bible says so. So, I mean, this is a very powerful sort of argument for a child where you have a geographic entity with Bible verses pushing together the narrative that this is our land because God said so, and not making, they're just leaping over this 2,000-year period in which they were absent from the land. And we can't even get into the idea of what was the promise of the land tied to, which is recognition of the Messiah, and that the Messiah was not recognized by the Jewish people, but that's a different conversation for a different episode. So that's the idea of Israel rewriting the past in order to control the present and the future. What about the idea of Palestinians as subhumans, which was the second point I wanted to talk about? Palestinians, pronounced Falastinians, and Palestine, Falastine, are the names the Palestinian national movement chose for their land and their people at the beginning of the 20th century, thus distinguishing themselves from the British label, from the Philistines, and from the Hebrews, and ridding themselves of all other connotations of Palestina. Even though the books studied here were published subsequent to the Oslo Agreement, which included the mutual recognition of the Israeli and Palestinian nations, they do not respect the name Palestinians call themselves by, Palestinians. The more left-wing books call them Arabs, Israel's Arabs, and Palestinians alternately, while the right-wing books call them Arabs, Israel's Arabs, and on rare occasions Palestinaim, which is usually reserved for terrorists. The label Arabs enhances the idea Israel has always tried to convey, that the Palestinians are not a nation by themselves, but are part of another, much bigger nation outside Israel, the Arabs. And this is a quote from Tzipi Livni when she was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The national solution of Israel's Arabs is elsewhere. In order to maintain a Jewish democratic state, we must constitute two nation states with clear red lines. Once this happens, I will be able to come to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, whom we label Israel's Arabs, and tell them that their national solution is elsewhere. This is a rare occasion in which a prominent leader suggests to substitute Israel's Arabs with Palestinian citizens of Israel. However, the reason for this shift is aligned with the old intentions and goals. Livni uses the label Palestinians for the same reasons the school books use the label Arabs, namely to indicate that these people, though they are the citizens of the State of Israel, do not belong where they actually live and work and where they have lived for generations. Livni is reiterating the ever-persistent idea of transferring them to the still non-existent neighboring state of Palestine. This speech is worth mentioning here because Livni spoke to high school students in Tel Aviv on the eve of their conscription. And once again, the note is, this is a problem that has to be solved, and that she will be able to go to them with a solution to the problem of your existence here. Authorized Israeli textbooks describe the Palestinians in ways that are typical of racist representation, that is, as primitive, subservient, deviant, criminal, or evil, and as a problem to be solved. This should not be treated merely as a reflection of the writer's personal opinions, but as a reflection of a large swathe of the official Israeli attitude towards the Palestinians as a whole. In books for the very young, years 1 to 4, the Palestinians, either the citizens of Israel or the Palestinians in the occupied territories, hardly exist. One cannot find them in any drawing, photographs, or major verbal texts, either factual or fictional. In anthologies, there is almost no trace of their literature or poetry, children's songs, proverbs, or folk tales, and there is hardly any trace of their existence in factual books about the State of Israel, which underlines again the idea a land without people for a people without land, except the first part of the premise is untrue. It wasn't a land without people, it was a land with a lot of people. Israeli high school students who are about to become soldiers are taught that the very existence of Palestinians in our midst is a problem that must be solved. For example, in the history school book The 20th, Professor Barnavi explains that annexing the Palestinian occupied territories to the State of Israel would create an absurd situation where the Jews would be a minority in their own land. And this, he adds, would turn the Zionist dream into a South African nightmare. The historian wrote these words while Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa. However, in his view, South Africa is still a nightmare for the white population, with whom he equates the Israeli Jews. Labeling a nation a problem is disturbing, and even more so finding it in a Jewish textbook only 60 years after the Jews were called the Jewish problem. And indeed, labeling the Palestinian people a problem signals not only their social exclusion from the mainstream society, but goes one step further and leads, as was the case of Jews and other unwanted groups in Europe, to the legitimation of their elimination. So that leads us to changes in vocabulary, changes in maps. In order, we saw a preview of that map earlier on. But everything about the books and what's being taught in school and the attitudes of government leaders and the attitudes of teachers and the attitudes of parents and the attitudes of Israeli society and the attitudes in the IDF have to underline the idea that the Palestinians don't exist, that they're a problem, that they're animals, and we have to get rid of them if we're going to be safe. This is a very famous quote from Golda Meir, that if the Arabs put down their weapons, we will have peace, but if the Jews put down their weapons, we will lose a state. Something like this. That this is the ongoing fear that apparently will live forever in the minds of the Israelis, which should indicate a problem if people are paying attention. Even in matters that do not touch upon national or ethnic matters such as industry, agriculture, or the professions, textbooks, following the social and political discourse, divide the Israeli life world ethnically into Jewish and non-Jewish, or Arab. This distinction is used in geography books to connote the difference between progress and backwardness, and illustrate on maps, graphs, and diagrams the incompletion of the Zionist project of the Judaization of the land. For instance, in the geography textbook Settlements in Space, a map of rural areas in Israel depicts the Jewish settlements in blue and the Arab villages in red. The text below the map defines the Jewish settlement as kibbutz, moshav, community settlement, etc., while the Arab villages are defined only as Arab, and that in spite of the fact that there are several kinds of Arab villages in Israel. In civics, the non-Jewish Arab sector connotes the centrality of the Jewish citizens and the marginality of the Palestinian minority. And in history books, it immediately connotes the distinction between right and wrong versions. The Jewish narrative is the right one, while the Arab narrative is the wrong one. In terms of modality, the Israeli versions of events are stated as objective facts, while the Palestinian Arab versions are stated as possibility, realized in openings such as, according to the Arab version. And so, what is an example of one of these massacres and the way that things are framed by the Israelis? There's actually a lot wrong with this. I hope I can cover everything. On the day the Sinai campaign started, the curfew was brought forward to an earlier hour, 5 p.m. That day, workers from Kafr Qasim returned to their homes after curfew without knowing it had been changed. The border guard soldiers who met them at the entrance to the village ordered them to stop, recognized them as the inhabitants of the village, and then shot them dead. They argued they had followed orders to shoot and kill indiscriminately anyone found outside their homes after curfew. 49 citizens of the village, including women and children, were murdered. The Prime Minister denounced the murder. The Knesset stood a whole minute to commemorate the murdered. The defendants were sentenced to prison terms of 7 to 17 years. The judge ruled that a manifestly unlawful order should be clear to every man who is a man. It is a moral test, if the eye is not blind and the heart is not corrupt. So that's a text from an Israeli school book. In this report, the soldiers are delegitimated through analogy with Nazis. They recognized the people as honest, innocent farmers, yet shot them to death. The connective nevertheless is implicit in the text, assumed by the sequence and by the conjunction and. The victims, though appraised for innocence, are of no interest and receive very little paper time. The important consequences of the murder are the trial and the enlightened sentence, appraised in this and all other reports as unprecedented. The report succeeds through a careful process of selection and omission of facts in delegitimating the act, socially excluding the killers, while legitimating the Israeli government and army and hailing the Israeli court. It foregrounds Israeli judges' courage and moral integrity. For that purpose, the text conceals important facts, such as the Prime Minister's order to deny the event for 6 weeks, or his refusal to put the army on trial, thereby laying all the blame, as the text does, on the border guards and exonerating their military commanders. The report praises the Prime Minister and the Knesset for commemorating the murdered for a whole minute, but avoids mentioning the murderer's release after a short while. It doesn't mention Colonel Shadmi's penalty of £2, or the fact that all the killers regained their positions in the army and governmental offices with the explicit help of the Prime Minister. It does not mention the overwhelming support of Shadmi by senior officers of the army during the trial and the worry expressed by one of them after hearing the verdict. I came here to see whether in the future we will have to go into battle with a lawyer. A concern that was repeated after the raid on Gaza in 2009. Such information would have hindered what seems to be the aim of the report, to fully legitimate the government, the court, and the army while delegitimating the killers as marginal members of society who do not represent Israel in any way, and who supposedly acted independently of the organization that had sent them to do the task. This impression is also achieved by providing the conditions while omitting the reasons for the massacre, so it would not seem pre-planned in the high windows. The orders given to the soldiers are presented as the murderer's argument and not as fact. Given the missing facts, we would have had the following teleological explanation. 1. Israel wanted to conceal the fact that it was going to attack Egypt and encourage an auto-transfer of its Palestinian citizens to Jordan. Israel considered that attacking Palestinian villages and killing some would divert attention away from the real war and encourage the rest of the Palestinians to flee to Jordan. Therefore, the curfew was changed without the villagers' knowledge, and Army Colonel Shadmi ordered the border guards through their direct commander, Major Malinki, to kill anyone who would be outside after 5 o'clock. This report, given in regular history books, has not yet found its way into textbooks, for it could shake the reputation of the IDF as a moral army that Israeli education is so keen to propagate, and which we know, in a post-October 2023 era, is a complete farce. We know that there is no such thing as the IDF as the most moral army in the world. So I think the postscript to this is twofold. One, I would encourage people to take a look at the lies that are told to Israeli school children through a wonderful documentary called Israelism, which I did a film club on, so I'll put a link in the description as well as a card for. And the Jews in that documentary talk about the fact that they were told that the land was empty. They were never told anything about the occupation. They were never told anything about apartheid. They had to learn all of this later on when they were older, but they were never taught this. So it's a systematic exclusion, and not just from this book, but from this documentary and from the testimonies of Jews. So it isn't, and Nurit Peled Elhanan is an Israeli herself. So these are not narratives of Palestinians, but Israelis who are recognizing the situation and then sharing it. So yes, there is propaganda in these school books and propaganda in the entire Jewish experience growing up. But I think the major counteracting to that, which may not have been seen in an academic study like this, but which is very obvious now, is that the internet is the great corrective here. That post-October 2023, when we have IDF soldiers uploading their war crimes to social media and everyone capturing them, and then once they're recognized, the Israelis delete them, but it's too late, that you cannot make the claim of being the most moral army in the world when everyone's caught you doing what you videotaped. And so the I would say monopoly of school books being able to set the narrative for young Israelis, not just and the time period of this book, but in the future, I think is under threat. So yes, I think the study is important. Yes, I think it's underlining these issues, but I do think we're in a different era now with the internet. So as I said, if you want to take a look at the longer version of this review, there's a link to it. If you want to support the channel, please consider hitting like, subscribe, sharing this with somebody who'd like to go a little deeper with how the brainwashing begins in Israeli society, such that you have an entire nation that stands by while people are being murdered, men, women, and children that are defenseless, that are not combatants. Part of it starts right here and starts at a very early age. They sleep very well at night. They don't think about it. And so, and when I say they, I say a majority of the population. Otherwise, something would have been done in the last year. You can also support me by sending funds via PayPal or buy me a coffee. You can also join my Patreon, become a YouTube member to get early releases of videos like this, talk to me behind the scenes, find out about different books that I'm working on that I may not review for various reasons. If you'd like to nominate a book for 2025, my Amazon wish list is there. If you buy one of those books and send it to me, I'll probably have a chance to review it next year. And a reminder that portion of the proceeds from all these different avenues to the channel will go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is a wonderful organization that helps Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get that care. You can learn more about them in the description and support them directly or support them indirectly by supporting this channel. Until next time, enjoy your reading.